Welcome everyone to the IOP Thursday seminar. We're very excited to have you here with us today. And I am super excited to hear Jessica give this work that's joint with Lonnie on the effects of the CTC on employment. And I have to give a particular thank you to Jessica because if you had looked at our schedule, you might have thought you were going to see Max through this, but Max emailed and said he couldn't give a talk. And I happened to know this paper was in the work, and I was like, hey, this would be perfect. So she agreed to give this talk only like a week and a half ago, or 2 weeks ago. Yeah. So tremendous thank you for her to put together slides, get up in front of us and talk about it, because it's something I know we're all super interested in. She has said she's happy to take questions as we go, but of course she reserves the right to shut you down if you're derailing the pace of her talk. So, take it away, Jessica.
Wonderful. Thank you, and thank you guys so much for coming. We really look forward to your feedback. So like Catherine said, please just ask away. So the title of this talk, Initial Evidence on the Employment Effects of the 2021 Fully Refundable Monthly Child Tax Credit. And this is, as Catherine said, joint with myself and Lonnie. And of course, we thank the IRP for all forms of support. So the question that we're asking is whether the 2021 expansion to the CTC enabled families, whether this child tax credit increased or decreased employment among parents. Oops, oh my goodness. Now you know everything. Oh goodness, there we go. Okay, so the monthly payments began July 15th, 2021, and they continued for 6 months. So every month from there to December, and families could sign up but couldn't receive payments until July 15th. And so this was a temporary expansion. So our question is basically, like I said, did this increase or decrease employment among parents, and were there heterogeneous effects according to parental marital status and education? So there's a much larger research looking at other forms of the child tax credit, previous versions of the child tax credit. But there's two in particular that simulated the employment effects of this version of the child tax credit. And those, their estimates vary just depending on which set of elasticities they select rather. But basically they estimate that there's a decline in parental employment between 385,000 and 1.5 million. And there's several quasi-experimental studies that give us insight into what we think this expansion might look like. However, these aren't perfectly generalizable to this setting, in part because of the version of the tax credit that we had in place before under the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. So I'll talk about that in a moment. But as I said, the simulation estimates are obviously sensitive to the choice of elasticities. So we wanted to use real-time data and see what the actual employment effects were when we estimated our models. So to preview our results, we do not find a significant reduction or increase in employment among parents relative to childless adults who, after the monthly child tax credit payments commenced. So I'll explain our identification strategy in a moment, but basically we identified insignificant 0.76% decline. We also find a 1.69% increase in parental employment among married parents who had at least some college. And when we added the control group, families who we observed in 2018 and 2019, we observe a marginally significant decline in employment, around 1%. However, this is concentrated among single parents with no more than a high school education. So the motivation for this analysis is under Build Back Better. There's this proposal to make this expansion permanent. And in order to fully evaluate the cost benefit of this type of expansion, we would need to know what are the actual real-time employment effects. And importantly, as many of you probably know, this is the first child allowance type anti-poverty program in the United States, and among the largest in terms of unconditional benefits, meaning that it's not dependent upon work. This has strong implications for child poverty, and the many benefits that we know come not just short-term, but also long-term benefits to alleviating child poverty. So there was a very interesting cost-benefit analysis that kind of simulated this type of expansion. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, but the long-run benefits, like the societal benefits, in terms of reduced medical costs and improved academic achievement, all of those tend to outweigh the immediate short-run costs. So the child tax credit initially was introduced in 1997 under the Taxpayer Relief Act, and more significantly under the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which put into place this version of the child tax credit between 2018 and 2025. It increased the amount of the credit from $1,000 to $2,000 and made $1,400 refundable. That's called the additional child tax credit. Children up to age 16 are eligible for the full credit. And it, just like this, there's a phase-out portion when you get up to higher earning single parents and married parents. However, some research since then, this is just one citation, but several others have found that around 30% of children were ineligible for the full credit. And around half of these were kids who were in some way historically disadvantaged. So, yeah.
Is the refund, is that, that's like for the filer, right? So
right.
If you had 3 kids, you'd be eligible for $6,000, but so if you don't owe tax, the most you can get is $1,400?
Right, exactly, yeah. So under the American Rescue Plan Act, this expanded CTC basically overrode the Tax Cut and Jobs Act version of the child tax credit. It increased the credit from $2,000 to $3,600 per child for kids who were under age 6, which is equivalent to $300 per month, because half of the credit is received as a lump sum when they file taxes the following year, and $3,000 for kids 6 to 17. So as you notice, 17-year-olds were added. They were not eligible before, but now they are. And, oh, here we go. So fully refundable, so that full credit can be received up to a higher earning threshold, regardless of your employment or tax filing status. So this is an important change, which I'll show you in a minute what the portal looks like. But basically, the IRS reached out to families who were non-filers, or possibly because they were unemployed or for whatever reason didn't file taxes, and enabled them to sign up to receive the monthly child tax credits, like I said, beginning in July. So unlike the TCJA version, there's no employment requirement. You can either elect to take the 6 monthly payments in 2021 and the remainder as a refund, so the other half in 2022, or just the lump payment option in 2022. And we...
If you were a filer, did you automatically default to one or the other?
You know, so they said that you have to sign up for it. In order to receive monthly payments, I don't think that you have to, I think that you have to opt out.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Right, but so everyone else would have to opt in.
Right, so if you were a tax filer, you were opted into the monthly and you could opt out, but if you weren't a filer, you had to opt into monthly.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. No, good question. So in order to be eligible, the child who you are claiming the child tax credit for had to have been born before or adopted before or in 2021 and did not turn 18 before January 1st, 2022. And they must live with a tax filer for more than half of the year. So on the IRS website, they have a lot of really interesting detailed questions to different variations of living arrangements and what families might be experiencing. They're very thorough. However, I noticed that most of the answers were added January 1st, 2022. So it could be the case that some folks were in that boat, right, where they weren't sure of their eligibility status, weren't sure that they could still sign up. You could actually sign up by November 15th if you needed to sign up. There was, as I said, no work or tax filing requirement. However, they do require that you have an address or a bank account, which, as you can imagine, for families who might not have been filing taxes, this could also affect your ability to receive payments regularly. Unlike the Tax Cut and Jobs Act version, payment can be reduced for overdue taxes or past due child support. This is also a big change that didn't happen before. So as you can imagine, families that have some characteristics, some dynamic characteristics that might make eligibility unclear, especially if those answers weren't posted until later, you can imagine why not everyone signed up who could have. So I like this figure. I didn't create it, but basically it shows the old Tax Cut and Jobs Act child tax credit. So it's this gray line, and it goes here. So it shows the phase-in portion and the phase-out. And then the blue lines are the expanded child tax credit. So you can see there's an elimination of this phase-in portion, and then higher credit, and then there's now 2 phase-out points as opposed to the single point that they had before. Okay, so here's the portal. This is what it looks like today. And there was a lot of effort to get families to sign up. It would be interesting. I haven't looked at it, but it would be interesting to see if someone could find like how much effort, like advertising dollars or other things that were put into getting folks to sign up. However, the IRS does have a zip code data set of the number of non-filers in each zip code. They don't tell you how much take up among those non-filers. They just say how many there are. So that's something. But yeah, this is what it looked like. And this is actually what it looks like now.
Is that all non-filers or non-filers that are eligible because we think they have children?
Yes, non-filers that are eligible. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So initial evidence, the IRS reported that 93 billion in benefits had been distributed to the parents of 61 million children, which is around 55% of what we think are eligible. And there's been a few studies that looked at reports of spending either through independent surveys or through the CPS, the Census Bureau's Household Pulse survey, which is a survey that was put into place like an experimental survey right at the beginning of the pandemic. It includes some information on employment as well. However, the employment question was changed right around the time that the child tax credit changed. So it's not clear whether it's the best or not the best option to use. But in the end, we ended up using the CPS monthly survey. However, so spending, the vast majority, I think I have a graph here, yeah, the vast majority of families with incomes below $35,000 reported spending their credit payments on all of these top 5 categories. So food, utilities, which includes bills in the actual survey question, rent or mortgage, clothing, education costs, and any of the above. And this obviously varied a little bit by parental income. There were higher rates of savings in higher earning families. But generally speaking, like food and savings and bills were at the very top for all of the income categories. Yeah. For which one? So they reported it had to select from like these categories, basically what did you spend the child tax credit on, and it wasn't very detailed. So for example, I was trying to look for like diapers, and I think that would fall under clothing, but it's not clear, like they don't list out everything.
So, I mean, money, part of its charm is it's fungible. So
Yeah.
I'm not, there is a bit of a conceptual issue here in how respondents think about what it means to spend a specific bit of money that comes in.
Right.
On a specific thing that they purchase. Is that something, how should I think about that?
I'm not sure.
Because I worry about social desirability bias here, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
Substitution, right? So I use that money to pay my
Yeah,
rent, but then the rent money pays for discounts.
right,
I mean,
right.
You just have to look at CES overall spending.
Yeah.
That's really hard to memorize.
Yes, please.
Unfortunately, the other surveys that were conducted on spending seem to have been, they were almost identical in terms of the questions and the structure. So I'll be interested to see if anyone, I'm sure someone has done something else, something more detailed.
I mean, you'd have to have the monthly budget of expenditure.
Yeah. So the expenditure, that's the bigger problem, right? Like, there's so many other ways we could actually figure out how this could transferred to, benefits for actual families in terms of, improved outcomes. Yeah.
It is a more general question, so we defer, but we know with the ITC, right, that some folks use it as kind of a savings account.
Yeah.
And depending on how people perceive the persistence of this program, right, if they perceive it as sort of a one-time thing, they might treat it that way. By durable, so that if they perceive it as something that might persist beyond the 6 months, they might respond differently. Did anybody ask folks, the actual recipients of these things, their perceptions about how persistent this was going to be?
That's interesting. I don't remember seeing that question in the Household Pulse survey, but it might have been in one of the other ones. Catherine, did you?
You could talk to Sarah, Halper, and Megan.
That's always true.
So Sarah has been asking families these questions.
Okay. So she probably has a better understanding, yeah.
Yeah.
And then there was another survey. They haven't published the post results yet, probably because they're processing them. But they asked great questions on how do you intend to spend the child tax credit, which will be helpful. And there was like 6% of the sample who responded that they intended to work less, which was interesting. So hopefully they also collected employment, actual employment, so they could, you know, see how that panned out. Yeah. Oh no. What did I do? Oh, sorry. Okay, so data. As I mentioned, we use the current population survey, the monthly income survey data from January 1st, 2018 through December 2021. This is a little different than if anyone's used ASEC, the March sample. So there aren't as many current and past employment and income questions asked. However, it's real time, so this advantage we thought was a good one. Around 38% of the sample have at least one child under 18, 28% have two children, and on average, parents are employed at higher rates than childless adults. Not by much, but on average within all the samples and all the time periods. We capture monthly employment over the previous week. So the way the question was asked was, in the last week, were you employed? And they asked more detailed questions among those who were employed, like how many hours they worked, whether or not they took leave, paid or unpaid. And then among the people who were unemployed, there's a series of questions about why they were unemployed, whether they were looking for work. And we created an indicator based on how long they reported being unemployed for whether or not it was less than 3 weeks. So there's obvious selection problems, right, into not only who signs up for the monthly payments, but then Jeff mentioned how they're using them. And we know that parents who opted in might differ in unobservable ways from those who didn't. So spending and saving patterns, although because of the short time span from when the expansion was passed in March to when it started, there probably isn't any fertility selection. There could obviously be when people file the lump sum if they have a child who was born in that time. However, there is near universal eligibility among parents. There is likely uneven take-up over time. I read some reports that disadvantaged families were less likely to know about the child tax credit at the time that they could sign up. So there were differences in how many people received payments by month. Yeah, Jeff.
There was discussion in the EITC world about, and there was a program for a while where you could take it monthly.
Where you could what?
Nobody chose to do that. You could take the EITC monthly, right?
Oh yes, yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And nobody, 2 or 3% people would sign up for that until they eventually got rid of it, it's my understanding. Here, lots more people are signing up for monthly instead of combined at the end. Do you have a sense of what's different here? Is it just the way that they set up the choice process? Or?
I think it's the default, right?
Yeah. So I mean, and the fact that it was like advertised and marketed, and you know, I don't know that there's much more that we know.
It seems like another, secondary finding of your study might
Right.
be that it informs that discussion a little bit.
Right, and it's not obviously not generalizable to like in a situation where they had to sign up, right, to receive any amount of money, or where moving from a temporary expansion to a permanent expansion. Yeah, exactly.
But also just to that point,
Yeah.
my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is that the vast majority of at least low-income families are tax filers, and so the people who are actually going in and then have to make a choice is, I had a number in my head at some point that was like less than 7% of low income.
Oh, I didn't see that, but that could very well be the
I
case.
may
Yeah.
have it slightly wrong, but it was not nearly as many eligible parent non-filers as the sort of concern about. I mean, we should always be concerned about signing them up, but
Right.
there was fewer of them that would be eligible than maybe.
That might have been the case, like since the payments ended. The thing that I found was more at the beginning, but it could very well
But if
be
people were
the case.
defaulted, if the majority of low-income families were defaulted in to get it monthly, that just tells you the default being
Right.
important.
Right.
Yeah.
A lot of people filed for the first time last year to get the rebates the refunds
That
in
might be
2020,
true.
so that brought a lot of non-filers.
Right.
Into the filing, yeah.
Right. That's another thing. The having information, like having some contact and communication with non-filers, is also an interesting don't know if that's a benefit or disadvantage, but it could be, right? So we use a difference approach to compare employment outcomes across parents and non-parents, people without children, who range in age between 15 and 64. We include a vector of controls. For marital status, it's just an indicator, married or not. Achieved education, citizenship status. We include season, month, and year fixed effects. And in the models that I show here, we also include state by month fixed effects. So there's the obvious threats that we've kind of talked about already. We're unable to condition on Tax Cut and Jobs Act eligibility because at least in the monthly data, we're unable to see whether or not they were working the prior year or whether they filed taxes. We know that childless adults are an imperfect counterfactual. There's a lot of literature on this. And in this case, however, because of the near universal eligibility, we thought it's definitely a comparison worth making. There's also compositional differences between 2021 and the prior years, which is something that we kind of thought about and tested. There's a lot of theoretical differences that we know, like differences in access to remote work and childcare and school and all those things that maybe were different between parents and people without children in earlier years versus later years. But when we used the March ASEC data, so this actually now has tax filing status and adjusted gross income and some other more detailed like income variables that you can't see in the monthly data, you can still see that there are differences between 2021 and 2018 and 19. And I'll explain why we're not looking at 2020 in just 1 minute. But you can see, like, for example, the larger increase in income in the population who's high education, meaning at least some college or more, and married, or and then you see other smaller differences, like you can see differences in baseline employment in several of the samples.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yep.
I not only can't see that part, but
Oh no, I'm sorry.
but I'm struggling a little bit. So the compositional changes that you're trying to, that you're talking about, could you just take one step back for an old slow brain and walk me through which?
Yes. Okay. So in thinking about what the proper control group is,
Okay.
right? Whether or not we should include 2020, 2019, and 2018. Our concern was that some of these compositional changes might affect.
And so you're worried about the people who are parents in 2021 might be different than the people who are parents in 2018 and 19.
Or their access to work supports or the environment in which work decisions might happen. Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. So let me show you. So what we basically did is we employed an event study model looking just at employment. And so this coefficient compares parents to people who are not parents. And this starts, I'm sorry, this is so small, so now you probably can't see. It starts in February 2018, and it goes up to December 2021. And you can see there's like this natural fluctuation in employment in the summer. In fact, each of these are at July. And so you see a decline up to July, and then it immediately returns, so meaning that parents are not in the labor force at the same rate of non-parents in these periods. However, you can see this is March 2020. There's an increase in employment among parents, which returns what you would think this is baseline, but it's actually not, because this July you would normally see this decline, and you don't see it in 2020. But then back to 2021, you can see some return to normalcy. You have that normal decline. And then the biggest difference that you can see just in this approach, right, is maybe a little bit slower return to work among parents relative to non-parents right after the payments were first given. Yeah.
So it's not an increase in employment, it's increase in relative employment, right? It's a relative difference in employment.
Right.
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 So can you talk to us about the occupational sector? So like one thing I might worry about is that childless parents or childless people are more likely to be young and in a service sector, which we know, right? Like so that they're actually sorted into different occupational sectors.
We didn't look at occupational sectors, but we did use Melissa Kearney's essential worker categorization, and it definitely seemed like parents, I didn't include it here, but parents have are more likely to be essential workers and actually were employed at a higher rate relative to non-parents' rate when the pandemic started. But that was the only difference when we compared across parents and non-parents who were essential workers and non-essential workers.
And essential workers could be healthcare,
It could, yeah.
grocery, but not
Yeah.
I mean, my concern would be like the fact that they'd be overrepresented in retail or leisure.
Right.
Or parents would be less represented in retail and leisure, which we know was hit hard in
Right.
lots of ways.
Yeah, we didn't look at that, but I think that's a good suggestion. Especially if there's like a way to classify employment categories, in terms of types of employment that might be more or less sensitive. But yeah, I hear what you're saying. Are there any that you know of?
I think just leisure, right? Like,
Yeah.
because essentials, I mean, I always just think healthcare and grocery stores.
Right.
For essential.
Right.
But that doesn't.
You're right, yeah.
And there's one in hospitality.
Okay.
Those are the ones, like all the.
Yes, hospitality, that's a good one. Okay. Yeah.
Sorry to already said this, but does this account for 1099 workers at all?
1099 workers. So this yes, it does. The way the question was asked, is were you employed, regardless of whether it was self-employed or, yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In your characterization of non-parents in this comparison, are there restrictions on age or?
Same restrictions as parents, so 15 to 64, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So, apart from the maybe like occupational differences thing, kind of why do we think that the employment of parents is going down less than the employment of non-parents here?
Do you mean?
Before the credit, right?
Yeah, yeah. You mean in the summer here?
No, not in the summer, in March of 2020.
Wait, sorry.
Because
So why?
the employment of parents is higher.
Oh, right here.
Yeah.
You're talking about right here? Yeah.
No, but like going up, why do we have that big increase?
Oh,
So that's what I was saying about the leisure.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of counterintuitive to me, and it could be this occupation thing, but you
Right.
would think that these parents who now their kids are home from school and they're doing virtual learning,
Mhm.
that parents would have to drop out of the labor force to take care of them, but you actually find that
The
parents
opposite.
are dropping out of the labor force less than
Right.
non-parents.
Exactly.
And I was right. So I was suggesting that it could be because non-parents are more likely to be in hospitality and leisure, and so
Right.
they took that early hit with everything shutting down.
Right.
Is there like another story for that, or kind of what did you make of that jump
I-
initially?
I don't know. I think we initially kind of made the same assumption, but it definitely is something that's worth looking into more. Unfortunately, in the monthly data, the reasons that people are unemployed are not. There's not a lot of great detail, but we did do similar event studies for every outcome that we looked at, and for the most part, they followed the patterns that we would expect. Yeah.
Can you do a similar thing with the pulse data?
So it started around the time at the start of the pandemic. I don't think it was perfectly in March, but it was around.
There would be like
Yeah.
some overlap, and so you could see if it tracked anything when you ran.
If this, are you saying if you use the same measure of employment?
Yeah, I don't know like how comparable it is with CPS, but if you ran a similar event study with stat data.
Yeah, so you could. The only problem is they changed the order of the employment question like right here. So you could, I just don't know. I would imagine it would be similar in the beginning, but that would be interesting. Because then you'd also have, ooh,
The pulse survey maybe had some questions related specifically to the pandemic that
yep.
could maybe shed some light on some of the unexpected patterns or whatever. Yeah, the differences.
We do have, there were some COVID-related questions in this as well. Like, were you unable to look for work because of the pandemic? And did you have access to remote work? I'm trying to think of what the other ones were. And those, I don't remember doing event studies for them, but we did kind of employ the same difference that we did here and didn't find any differences. But that was around the child tax credit. It might be worth using those at least to look at this period, but I agree, like the household pulse survey would probably shed some more light on that, because you're right, they have a lot more detailed questions on COVID-related difficulties. And they also have information on, that's where the child tax credit spending comes from. So
I feel like the point about the occupations and sort of the child care, like my biggest concern is the child aspect of, you know, needing to provide care and not being able to work because of the inconsistency in being able to have care for your kids. And
Yep.
so to the extent that like you could sort of provide robustness or something using the sort of out, I think be helpful.
yeah, for sure. I did also think it was interesting. It was not only here, but elsewhere that childcare was such a small expense. In talking to some families with lived experience, it seemed like a little more popular than it actually was in terms of how people actually spent the money. But it would be really interesting to look at that with respect to like the generosity of the Child Development Fund, like, you know, childcare supplement stipends. Yeah.
So, against all popular perception, there was much less loss of childcare than people seem to appreciate. So school-wise, yes, but particularly like many childcare centers shut down for short periods of time, but then reopened, you know, within a month or two. So it's this mess of really it was the school-age kids and things like that.
And also though, like my understanding is that if your kid got sick, then they were out for like 2 weeks. And
Yeah.
so there was a lot of unpredictability. So even if you had child care centers open,
Correct.
the actual ability to like maintain a job.
But they also had expanded leave.
Right.
You had expanded leave to be able to take sick leave to take care for kids, stuff like that.
So
For
there's
people
people in like full time.
Yeah. So I'm just saying, like, I agree that childcare is a concern, but also sometimes people see it as a bigger concern than it was for some folks.
Yeah, that's for sure. Childcare has been really fun for parents who have young kids. For me, it's been a lot more, it's been just wonderful. Seeing my kids as much as I get to.
I know.
I love them.
I'm not saying
No, I know what you're saying. Yeah.
To that point though, like the restrictions and access to childcare really depends on where you live.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In Florida,
How many
schools
kids?
didn't
Yep.
close,
Yep.
You know, so
Yeah.
there's definitely geographic variation in thinking about
Yeah.
who needed access to childcare or paying additional costs.
Right. And
Yeah.
just, to that point, here in Wisconsin, the only places that had restriction on childcare after an initial shutdown was Dane County and Milwaukee County. The rest of the state was not.
It's amazing. They said every time they've closed, they said, well, we will lose our license if we don't respond this way, which is amazing. It's amazing. It's meant a lot of home time.
Maybe you're getting to this, but this suggests looking for human effect.
What? Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Maybe you're getting to this, but this discussion suggests looking for treatment effect heterogeneity by state or locality, if you have it, or by state based on whether the school is closed or not, how much they closed, what child care rates were.
Yep. We tried to kind of poke at that a little bit. I would be super interested. So there's this MCH data. Have you heard of this? So they have like information. They did a survey of school districts to try to get the timing of when the schools like started and closed, and then what mode they opened in. And it's not perfect. So I saw someone else had used like SafeGraph data to try to get a sense of like how people were moving, like how much of the time were they in schools versus not in school, which is an interesting approach. But I found that it just didn't have the same variation in the MCH data. But I'd love to hear if somebody else had some other thoughts on school data, because as far as I know, the MCH data is like the best that I could find. Actually having dates, school districts, and mode that they opened in, which is super important. But I also like Catherine's idea of looking at where child care centers had to fall under the social distancing and quarantine guidelines.
And also, I will for you say we should let you get to the rest of your paper.
Sorry. I'm sorry. Okay, so we covered that. Sorry, this is so small. I'm just gonna move on. So these look really small. I apologize. They look so much bigger on my computer. But basically, in So when we restrict the panel to just 2021, so we find a 0.6 percentage point reduction, which translates to 0.76% reduction, but it's insignificant in employment among the full sample. And interestingly, the sample of parents or people who are have low education and are single have an insignificant increase. The ones who are low education and married have an insignificant decrease, 1.75%. The high educated single ones have an insignificant decrease, and the high educational married group has a significant increase. It's about 1.69%. And we scale the coefficient by 1.55 to just approximate take-up based on the 55% take-up that we found in the, from the IRS. But when we add 2021 or 2019 to the control group, thinking maybe that is a better, an interesting counterfactual worth considering, we find that the coefficient is a little bit larger but stays insignificant. And we then find a significant decline in employment among the low ed single group. So that's about 2.85% of baseline employment before the child tax credit. And then we see basically the same patterns in these groups, but that positive effects among the high ed married group are retained.
Again,
Yep.
slow person.
Sure.
Are these all members, like all adults in the household? Is this head of household?
All adults.
All adults.
Yep. Yep. So we interpret it as like an intent to treat effect, because like I said, we can't see take up in this data, and we don't know whether they worked in the last year in this data. So it's just cross-sectional, are you employed or not employed?
So for both, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to I'm trying to wrap my head around the higher ed married finding.
Sure.
Right? So you have two people in the household. One could be, they both have to be, do you see what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
they're both in the sample.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Yep.
Yep. And so, and then you correct for family, like how do,
We have family weights. So we weight and we cluster by the state, and then we have family level weights.
but those are non-independent observations, right?
Right.
So how do you think about
Right. So I guess so that would make sense, right, to limit the sample to then only the head of household.
well, except then you'll miss the substitution of
Right.
second earner, not,
Robust and
Right.
yeah, so I feel like there has to be some recognition that you can't just put in partner people in the same.
Right. That's a good point.
Am I
Yeah.
wrong with that?
In theory, the state level clustering, if they're using the way of
Okay.
Yeah, we are.
Just as a state care.
Yeah. No, that's helpful. Did I say this panel?
Is the head of household or who's the primary earner? I know that's outdated.
You know, so in the monthly one, because the tax filer isn't always the same as the head of household, right? So you kind of need March 2022 ASEC to come out so that you can match.
I guess I was just thinking if you could also look at like two earner, like if you could look at whether there's a decline in a secondary earner to get to the child care, right? Like that's a pattern that people, I think, looking at the economists, might expect is that
There's some over there too.
in the presence of child care or whatever,
Right,
you might
right.
see a decline in the secondary earner, but whatever, continue.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Okay, so we because of those compositional differences, though, for the rest of the presentation, I'll show you mostly everything with just the 2021 panel.
Jessica?
Yeah.
You may have said this and I missed it in all the flurry of discussion. The coefficient is, how is the June 2021 employment treated?
How is June? What do you mean?
So is it counted as pre?
Yes.
So back on your original chart, it does look like there was some anticipatory effect there in June of 2021.
So
The parental employment is relatively.
So this is, but this, I don't know how to, right, this is an interesting, right, because it's also, you have it also in 2019 and 2018. So if you were to just look at like levels, right, it's I don't know if it's an anticipatory effect. It could be. I'm not sure. How would you all interpret that? Because it's right in line with the other June, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. That was kind of our. I don't know. I think it's interesting. Like I said, the biggest difference is.
I'd be curious to see the results excluding
Oh yeah. Okay.
from it, and just compare earlier pre-June with post-July,
Right.
and then see if that does anything.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah, we can try that. Thanks, Steve. Okay, so this, again, so sorry this is so tiny, but these are the two simulation studies, and they estimate that, as I mentioned, the different declines in employment based on their approach, based upon their choice of elasticities, but like this one has a reduction in employment by 2.6%, and this one is about 0.61%. So ours is a little bit higher than the lowest estimate, but quite a bit lower. I put the two numbers here. This is the number they put in the paper, but they used a different denominator. So when I adjust to the 2020 census estimates, it's more like this. It's more like the 1.2 million.
Sorry, just back to thinking about these different comparison
Uh-huh.
groups. I guess like the main thing that I'm thinking about is that there might be not only these compositional changes that you're talking about, but also just the way that families react to COVID could be differently
Right.
across, like single people, or I guess childless people and parents.
Right.
And so is your thought sticking with the 2021 kind of thinking that like there wasn't that much change in COVID over that time?
Yeah,
period?
like any of those changes would have happened by then. And it makes sense why you also wouldn't use 2020, right? But yeah, that's the thinking, that many of those changes would have already precipitated by the time 2021, because it does kind of start to resemble the previous years, right?
Okay, and then so sorry, what is this is like July is when it happened?
Yep, July 15th,
Okay.
right?
So
July
I-
15th
yeah.
to December 15th.
If people were vaccinated, it was like relatively low risk around that time. I guess I would be concerned if we were then getting into like recent months where there has been a lot of increase in COVID risk.
Yeah, actually, we did look at that. We looked at COVID rates, and I shouldn't have said that because I don't remember if the finding was especially wonderful, but it was right. I think we took it out right. But if I remember correctly, it went the opposite direction that you would have expected. So yeah, Jeff.
Is there a broader version of that question? I was on a couple of technical working groups of evaluations that were either in progress or about to start when the pandemic started.
Uh-huh.
And there were long discussions about, if it started, should we stop it and start again when the pandemic's over? And if it's not started yet, should we hold off? Because and some of that had to do with interview mode effects and things. But a lot of it had to do with just external validity for non-COVID time.
Yeah.
And I think that applies in two directions here, right? It applies to these simulation studies because they're taking non-COVID elasticity
Right.
and using the COVID times. And it also applies to your results and thinking about what do these mean in, post-COVID or with endemic COVID.
Right. There's a great discussions about this in both of those simulation papers, right? And I'm sure many of you have read the Corinth paper and the letter that that they submitted on the National Academy of Sciences choices of elasticities, like with respect to the substitution effect, right? So I forgot what I was going to say. Yeah, it's in this case we felt like 2021 was a better sample, but there's so many ways that this isn't generalizable, right? It's temporary. And so it probably would be different if it were to become permanent. But a lot of those elasticities came from the literature from like EITC, expansion / introductions and from different time periods. But what I find remarkable, so the Corinth paper, they did try using the NAS set of elasticities. And when they did that, their estimates were almost identical to NAS. And in this paper, they tried the NAS elasticities, and then they also tried some other elasticities from other papers. And unlike the Corinth paper, the Golden paper, they used gender and marital status specific elasticities. So surprisingly, they do account for the income and substitution effects, and their estimates are much closer to ours, which is interesting. This isn't the best figure, but I thought it was easier than looking at a table. But so the hollow circle is the full sample. The low ed single sample is the dark circle, and then the low ed married is the plus sign. The high ed single is the hollow diamond, and the high ed married sampled is the black diamond. And you can see this increase in employment right here among the high ed married group. In terms of leave, there's some literature that suggests that low, like disadvantaged families are more likely to take unpaid leave, especially in states that don't have paid leave. So this says whether or not they took any leave, whether it was paid or unpaid. And you can see there's a slight increase in the whole sample, and it's only marginally significant in that more advantaged group. We didn't see any differences in whether or not they were employed for less than 3 weeks. However, one thought we had was changing that so it's employed for the amount of time that they would have been receiving the payment, so based on which month they're in the survey. And then there was another question for those who were unemployed, whether or not they left their job voluntarily. And you can see there's really no effects except for a decline here among the higher ed married group. So because of these difficulties, because of these difficulties with like thinking about what the proper counterfactual is, we thought, what if we just constrained the sample to parents only? And because there would obviously be like a dose response type relationship within parents who have more than one child, especially depending on the child's age, we then, of course, did the same thing. So an event study with parents only. And you can see there's definitely less concerning pre-trends in this period, but also throughout the entire period. Okay, so go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, do you know like when the eviction moratoriums are being lifted over this time? Because I might expect that to be something not relevant to this, but to the
Yeah.
versus non-parental. I would
Yeah.
imagine that those would affect parents, families with children more.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I have seen that data. I think that's a really good idea. We can look at that. So this graph basically compares parents with one child relative to those who have 2 or more children at the time of the study. And you can see there's no effects for employment. There's a small but insignificant decline in the single low educated group in terms of taking any leave. No, yep.
Slow again. So if it's higher, that means the parents with 2 children are employed more.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. And then no effects on whether employed for less than 3 weeks, and the same for left voluntarily. Yep.
Does it act as percentage points?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so like that would be like 1 percentage point for that.
Yeah.
Second. Okay.
Yeah. We also we constrained the sample to only women, so with and without children in this case. Now we're back to the sample of yes or no children. And you can see there's a slight significant increase again, as we observed before in 2021. However, when we include 2018 and 2019 in the control group, you can see there is a slight decline here. And that translates, I calculated it. It was like a decline of around 59,000. So pretty small, but definitely significant in that sample, which actually lines up nicely with the literature. It's just a lot smaller than the simulation studies suggested. And then, as I mentioned earlier, because 17-year-olds weren't actually included in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act version of the CTC, we limited this sample to only parents who had their youngest child was 17. So there's no way they would have received the child tax credit before under Tax Cut and Jobs Act. And you can see there's definitely some different responses here, but among the high ed single, you see an increase in employment among parents in both samples relative to non-parents. So we also limited our sample to parents of infants, meaning under 12 months. So childless adults versus parents of infants or children under 12 months. And we find no effects again in that sample. We also included a third interaction effect, which I don't think I included, for whether there was paid family leave entitlement in place in the person's state at the time 2021. And it was at the time the child tax credit passed. And we didn't find any differences. So that was the group that you kind of might think, right, if you just had a child, and especially if you didn't have access to paid family leave, you can see how someone might use that as like a way to take maternity leave, but we didn't see that. We also looked at the total number of children and then the number of children by age, thinking that the payments would be higher if you have more younger children. We didn't see any differences or like dose response type relationships there. And then, like I said, we also didn't see any differences by essential worker status. So we've discussed most of these. Response might have been driven by parents' knowledge that expansion was temporary. There could have been anticipation effects, masked or also in that, that lead up to when the child tax credit started. And we, in this, right now, don't have any data on take-up, so we're limited to intent to treat, but it sounds like it might be worth using the household pulse survey to supplement this. So the implications, one, the group at Columbia estimated that the child tax credit was linked to reduction in poverty of around 30%, and after the child tax credit ended in December, they estimated that child poverty went up 40%, which is interesting. And then there's like a long literature on the impacts of relieving child poverty. In addition, Catherine's study on neuroplasticity. There's a lot of effects that are nicely outlined in this Garfinkel cost-benefit analysis paper, if you're interested. But basically, reduced neonatal infant mortality, premature mortality, improved health, cognition and academic achievement, other measures of adulthood human capital, and then crime and maltreatment, you might think, would be impacted. So in conclusion, we find no significant reduction in employment among parents under the temporary expansion. And according to that cost-benefit analysis, this expansion would come at a cost of $100 billion, but bring around $800 billion in social benefits, reduced medical care expenditures, increased likelihood to work, and so on and so forth. Yeah?
I know the data's probably not out yet, or
Yeah.
isn't out yet, but something that's really interesting to think about is the way that the child tax credit could sort of allow you to delay your employment search or sort of look for a better job, and so
Oh, yeah.
about when the tax credits end, I don't know, I just don't
Like a quicker,
you were gonna look
yeah,
for
yeah.
like later effects, like once it's removed.
Yeah. Or like the quality of like the fit between the employer and the employee. That could, yep. I could also see the same thing with childcare. If you have more time, right, to find a childcare that works, then you might have a better fit. That's really interesting. Yeah.
Two questions. The first is back to when you were showing it in some group. I think this was when you were looking at the one child versus multiple children.
Uh-huh.
When you find the increases, oh no, it wasn't this one. It must have been the next one. Oh, somewhere there was like some significant increases. Yeah, so.
Maybe were you thinking of this? The high-end
Yeah.
married?
Yeah, so I guess, what is the story there for that? Because it seems like, unless I'm thinking about this wrong, like the income and the substitution effect both go the other way.
Right.
I think it's using the resources to support employment. So you can buy a car instead of have to take a bus and commute. You can, because it's high end, so maybe they aren't on a bus, but and pay for childcare.
Yeah.
Together.
Yeah.
And then my other question, so I know that you're not going to get this in the CPS, but I wonder if maybe it was in the Pulse survey.
Mhm.
Do they ask any question about political affiliation?
Ooh. I don't know.
I don't know.
They might have in the
Just about
polls.
different
Does anyone else know? Oh, I can look in the polls. That's a good question. Yeah. What was your question?
I had a question, just in terms of thinking about how to apply these sorts of results to, like, if the tax credit was, if expansion was extended, like, one difference is that, if you have a small child, you're getting $300 a month check, but you're also getting $1,800 now, right?
Yeah.
When you file your taxes, which, if it was extended, wouldn't happen again.
Right.
Well, actually, it might now, but, at some point it would stop happening. And so, should we think about that $1,800 as somehow playing a role in what you're seeing in this time frame?
I think we should. I don't know how, right? Because, well, I suppose in the household pulse survey you can see even if they don't match it to tax-im, you could match it to tax-im and see among those who didn't take the monthly payments and then among those who did, yeah. But it is a different implication than if this were to become permanent, absolutely, right? Because if people are anticipating having the $1,800, you can imagine they might spend differently than if they weren't. And then that $1,800 would have its own independent effect, right, year over year.
No idea. People were anticipating it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, or when, if they did, yeah, yeah. That's interesting. Yeah.
Along those lines, though, thinking about the stimulus payments in
Uh-huh.
2021, are you worried about those?
Are we worried about those having their own effects on employment?
Yes.
Sure. I think that's definitely worth, yeah.
So there'd be of different magnitudes for the
Yeah.
rate for single versus.
Yep.
So I'm just wondering if that, I don't know how that plays into it.
No, I think at one point we did look at each of those points, like when stimulus and other payments were paid out. But that might be worth going back to, yeah.
I mean, what's interesting about the stimulus payments is it's gonna be non-overlapping sample with the parents, because like with the parents, some pretty high income people
Yeah.
could be getting those
Stimulus.
the child one, right?
Yeah.
But not so high if it was the stimulus, and so you might be able to sort of net out that.
Right. Right. That would be interesting. Now I'm curious if the household pulse survey might have to wait till the March ASEC. I feel like that's where the most detailed information is, but if anybody else knows, yeah.
Any other questions?
Well, would you say that both of those factors, like the $1,800 I was talking about, and then the stimulus things, like those are additional payments, if anything, if there's an income effect, right?
Mhm.
Do you think that that would make it larger? Which is
Yeah.
not what you're
Yeah. Yeah. You would. I mean, yeah. I feel like, does anyone remember the size of the stimulus payments?
Per person.
Per person, right. They were pretty substantial.
Right, did it for the kids too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember seeing that they were just much larger in magnitude over a longer period of time relative to the child tax credit as a percent of income. So, right, it would be important to net out those as well. But yeah.
Well, I will heartily thank you. You did not disappoint. This is wildly engaging.
Thank you.